Hey everyone, it's Colt. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're talking about CSS text properties, of which there are quite a few. We're going to cover things like font size, font family, font weight, font style, text transform, text decoration, text shadow, text align, line height, letter spacing, and word spacing. Whew! Quite a few different properties. This video is part of a series I'm doing. I'm calling it Colt's Code Camp. The goal is to teach people to code, especially those who are stuck at home in self-isolation or quarantine or jobless, whatever the situation is. So if you know of anyone who might benefit from this course, please consider sharing. This is video 10 in the course, but also you can just hop in now and learn about CSS text properties. As you can tell, I kind of am abusing these motion graphics from my slideshow. I don't know how to make nice animations for these videos. If anyone does, by the way, reach out to me, send me an email, and we'll work out some sort of trade or a deal to make that happen, because I need some nice animations. And I think we can begin now. Here we go. So the first property we'll take a look at is font size. It's pretty self-explanatory. It is going to change the font size of whatever you're selecting. Now, what is not very self-explanatory are the multitudes of potential units that we can use to measure fonts. There are many units in CSS that you can use, not just for font size, but also things like width and height and margin. They include things like pixels, px, percentages, ems, spelled em, rems or root ems, VHs, VW, and then named sizes like extra small, small, medium, that sort of thing. So I'm not going to go into those right now. I am going to do a separate video on those units because they're a very important part of CSS, especially when it comes to making responsive websites, scalable text, all that stuff. So that will be a separate video. For now, we'll just use pixels, px. Okay, so font size, if we just limit ourselves to px, is pretty straightforward. We pick a size in pixels, and then we set font size to be that size. So over here, I've got a new code pen, and there's not a whole lot going on, but I've got a little nav bar to be, a nav bar to be, and then an H1 with some paragraphs, an H2 with some paragraphs, and all this text is hipster ipsum text, just placeholder text. And I've got some sections wrapping around, like this is a section here, that's a section there. So if I were to select something like the H1 and give it, here, let me make this a bit larger here, give it a larger font size. How about 60 px? There we go. You can see that it scales up to be 60 pixels. Another thing that's important to know about font size, if I set font size on all paragraphs, like this paragraph right here, it has an anchor tag nested inside. Let's set the font size to be something tiny, like 10 pixels. You'll see that everything scales down. So that inline element, that taxidermy anchor tag, is going to inherit its font size from the parent, which is a paragraph. But I can also call that one anchor tag out. I could say any anchor tag inside of a paragraph, your font size should actually be 20 pixels, and its font size grows. All right, so that's kind of it for font size. If you set a font size on a parent and the children don't have their own font size, like this anchor tag inside of a paragraph, then that anchor tag is going to resize unless you call it out specifically. One other thing, we haven't talked about ems and relative units. These are all absolute units. Well, pixels, we're saying exactly 10 pixels or 20 pixels. But if I select one of these sections or all sections, you'll see, let's go over here, that I have a section wrapping around an H2 and a couple paragraphs. So each of these is a section. If I set the font size on the section to be, how about 25 pixels? Can you see that the H2 and the paragraphs resize? Let me do that again. Let's go to 40 pixels. Both of them resize, and this H2 is definitely not 40 pixels. So H2s have a size set by default using a relative unit. And we're not going to talk about those relative units right now, but basically there's a proportion that will be kept. This is always going to be, I think it's 1.5 times, or it might be 2. I can't remember the exact number, some number times the font size of the parent. So when I change that parent, this is scaling and so is this. But we're not talking about those relative units for now. Just know that they are a thing, and that will be a separate video. Okay, Next up, let's talk about text align. So text align is how we can change the horizontal alignment of some block of text. We can align something to the left, which is the default, right, center, we can justify, and there are some other values like justify all, never used that, start, end, match parent, never used any of these down here. We're just going to focus on left, right, center. So let's align one of these things. How about this H1 here? So H1, the property name is text-align, and then I can specify something like right. And there we go, it aligns to the right side. Now that doesn't mean that everything automatically aligns or moves all the way to the right side of the screen. That's just a special case with, well, not a special case, but that's the case with block level elements that extend all the way across the screen. If we try and align, I don't know, how about one of these links, an anchor tag inside of an li? I'll just select that. So li anchor tag text align right. Nothing changes. It doesn't matter. There's no space for them to be aligned. They are sized based off of the content inside. They are inline elements. So you can see right there, right? That's the full width of that element being highlighted. There's nowhere to move to be aligned to, right or left or center. Versus our H1 is block level. So all of that blue space that's being highlighted is space that we can align inside of. Now, if I took each li, or each anchor tag, and I gave it display of block, or even just inline block, if you didn't watch my video on the box model, and you're unsure about block and inline, definitely check that out. And then if I give them a width, how about 300 pixels? Now, when I align them to the right, they actually have space to move. Same thing with center and with left, right? If I gave them a background color of pink, we can see where they're being aligned inside of. So that's center and that's right. So that's text align. I think I'm going to undo most of that anyway. I might center our H1, not that we're going for beauty here anyway, but there we go. Now it's centered. So next up, we'll take a look at font weight, which is how we control the weight or the boldness of our text. So we have a couple different options for the values. We can use keywords like normal and bold, but we can also use numeric values. They're multiples of 100, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 100. Those are the different values. However, we actually won't have access to the majority of these unless we include a font that has different font weights. Most of the default fonts that we'll have access to are system fonts in our browser. We'll only have font weight of 400 and 700. 400 is normal weight. So like this text right here is font weight 400. So is this. And this is bold, which is typically 700. So I could unbold my H1 if I wanted to in a couple ways. I could say font weight is normal using the keyword, and there it goes, back to normal. Or I can set it to 400, and we don't see any difference. I could make it bold again by setting it to 700. So something like 900 is supposed to be extra bold, but we don't have access to an extra bold font here. So it just picks the closest weight that it can. Same thing with 100. That's supposed to be super light. It can't find 100 or 200 or 300, but it does find a 400 or normal font weight. So that's what we end up with. It just uses the closest font weight. Now we'll see how to include our own fonts. And when we do that, we can use these other font weights. But for now, it's just normal and bold, or 400 and 700. So that's font weight. We also have font style, which is how we designate text as italicized or non-italicized, just normal text. So font weight is boldness, font style is italics. So I could make my H1 italicized if I do font style. And then if we look at the possible values, we have normal and italic. When you use italics, you're actually using a separate font face. So there's a normal file for that font and then an italic font, totally separate. And then I guess oblique is another option. I've never used it before, but it is an option. Anyway, we're working with italics. So I'm going to set font-style to be italic right there. And we'll see that there we go. We get our italicized text. I can set it back to normal. and I could do the same thing to something that's normally italicized, like a EM element. If I put that around, I don't know what, let's put it around my brand up here, EM for emphasis, which is not really a good use for EM. I'm going to delete it, but it is italicized. Then I could select that and say font style is actually normal. Don't be italicized. And I would emphasize it in some other way. Anyway, that's font style. That gives us our italicized text or normal text. And then font weight is going to bold something or change the thickness of the font. Now we get to one of the most important, font family. Now I've waited on this one a little bit because it takes a little time to explain. Font family is how we actually change the font itself. Right now we've been changing the size, the weight, the alignment, but if we want to change the actual font that is being used, we need to use font family. Now in order to understand font family, you need to understand fonts and system fonts specifically. So browsers do not have fonts that are installed in the browser. There are few standardized fonts across every single platform. There are fonts that come built in on every Windows machine. There are fonts that come built in on every Mac. There are fonts that come built in on mobile devices. And there is overlap, but there's a lot of whatever the opposite of overlap is. There's a lot of great fonts that might work on a Mac, and you could write a website that uses one of those fonts, test it on your Mac, and then someone opens it on a Windows machine. They don't have access to that font. So here's a web page called CSS Font Stack. And this gives us some general percentages of common fonts and how many Windows machines have them and how many Macs have them. So things like Arial are a pretty safe bet, almost 100% on Mac and PC or on Windows. But then there are other fonts like Optima, where we've got 2.5% of Windows machines have Optima. So we have to be careful with fonts. That's one thing that you have to consider. Impact 0% on Windows. If we want to ensure a consistent experience, a consistent font or fonts across all platforms, we either have to pick from one of a pretty small subset of fonts that is compatible with all machines, or we need to include our own fonts, which is something we'll talk about in a separate video. So this doesn't mean that you have to use these fonts and you can't ever use any other fonts, but it just means if you want to use those fancy fonts, you can't rely on people to have them on their machine. You need to make sure that you include the font. Again, I'll have a video on that. Most likely that will be tomorrow's video. It's a pretty straightforward and fun topic. Okay, so for now, if we're going to pick from some of these fonts, let's go with, how about something like Verdana. In order to use the font, once I've picked one, all I need to do is set font family to be the name of that font. So font family Verdana. I could set this just on my H1, font family Verdana, and there we go. We have that new font. Now it only applied to our H1. Let's pick something else. How about something that will only work, actually I was going to do Impact, but it's such an obnoxious font. How about something like Futura? This is a Mac only, or almost Mac only font. I'm going to set this on section. So each section here, I haven't selected that. Section, font, family, Futura. And notice what happens. The H2s and the paragraphs have a new font. So they inherit the font from the parent. So they don't have their own font set like my H1 does up here. Instead, they just look to the parent to see, is there a font defined on you? And if not, is there a font defined on the parent's parent or on the body? And eventually they'll hit the default font, like here, whatever the default font is in Chrome. I can't remember actually. I'm really bad with typography, but it's some default font. I did not set this. But if instead of doing section font family Futura, if I did body, now everything is Futura except for this H1 where I explicitly set it to be Verdana. I don't know which way to pronounce that. Okay, so that's how we can set a single font, but often what we want to do is actually set something called a font stack, which would look something like, let's see if they have an example, something like this maybe, or like this right here. That's a better example, where we actually have multiple fonts in order. And this is called a font stack. Basically, we're indicating here's our first choice font. And if this machine doesn't have that, then use this one. If that machine doesn't have it, use this one. So let's try that. Why don't I pick a font that I know my Mac does not have? So a Windows only font like whatever, Segoe UI, Mac 0%. So if I try using that as the font family on my body, Segoe UI, we go back to the default font, I'm pretty sure. Let me just double check if I get rid of that. Yeah, it looks identical. So whatever the default font is on a Mac, again, or on Chrome, I can't remember what it is, but that's what we end up with. I guess I could figure that out very quickly. If we just go inspect one of these elements here, look at the computed styles, it's just Times is the name of the font. All right, well, that's what it's using, the default. It is not using the font that I set, Segoe UI. So I can use a font stack where I specify this is my first choice. And if that's not found, I'd like you to use some other font. How about what we were using before, which is Futura, which is a Mac font. And then let's just start with that. So we have Segoe UI, comma, Futura. And now I should get Futura loading here. But if you were to view this on a machine that does have Segoe UI, you should see that font. All right, so that's the first bit of font stacks. You can continue to chain these and have a different hierarchy. And then what you can also do is have a fallback sort of generic type. What do they officially call it here? On MDN, they refer to it as a generic font family. So what we can do is specify, if all else fails, just use some serif font or some monospace font or a cursive font or even a fantasy font, which I don't think I've ever really used. These are different generic categories of fonts, right? So you can see here, these are different sans serif fonts. Here are different serif fonts. Here are different monospaced fonts. Fantasy. This allows me to say if all else fails, if you can't find this one or this one, then go with a sans serif is what I would do here because both of those fonts are sans serif. It's a way of at least trying to control a little bit what the experience is like for somebody, what their font looks like, even if you can't pick the specific font. So we're not going to see that come into effect. But if I did that Segoe UI, which I don't have, and then Fantasy, there we go. I think this is Papyrus, which is a fantasy font. And then if I did Monospace, let's do that next. Just another generic type, Monospace. That's what we end up with here. Kind of like that. But it doesn't really make sense to use Segoe UI and then the fallback have it be monospace. I mean, you can do whatever you want, but it would make more sense to do something like Monaco and Lucida Console and then monospace, because those are both monospace fonts. So maybe I'll just rewrite that really quickly. Let's do Lucida Console, which my Mac does not have. And then the second option is Monaco, which my Mac does have. And then the fallback will be monospace. Okay, so if I leave off Monaco, we still use that fallback monospace. I'm not sure what font that is versus Monaco, but there's some difference there. That's the basics of font family and specifying a font stack. Whatever order you put here does matter. This will be the first choice, second, and then in this case, our third and final fallback, just any monospace font. So don't forget that tomorrow I'll show including your own custom fonts and how you can use a tool called Google Fonts to make fancy looking nice typography, much better than these sort of standard plain fonts, and also how you can make sure they're supported across all platforms. But for now, these are some of the web-safe fonts. Next up, we've got three properties that I'll group together. Not that they're necessarily related, but they all have to do with spacing things. So we've got line height, letter spacing, and word spacing. So let's begin with line height. Line height controls the height of each individual line of text. So let's do, I don't know, I guess all paragraphs. We'll just set line height on there. And once again, we have lots of choices for units. We're not going to talk about that here. If you know about different CSS units, you can use them, but we're just going to focus on pixels for now. So let's set the line height to be 20 pixels. The font size is 10 pixels. The line height is 20 pixels. So let's do something even more extreme. How about 100 pixels? There we go. You can see the height of the line here is quite large as I highlight something, even though the text size is small. So that's line height. Then we have letter spacing and word spacing. So let's do 10 pixels between each word or 100 pixels between each word. It's just going to replace the spaces that we have with really large spaces, 100 pixel wide spaces. That's word spacing, and you can use these other units we're not going to talk about, but if I did 3 rems, it still works. The point is that we have different options, even if we're only using pixels for now. And then we have letter spacing, which is the same idea, but for each individual letter, we can put space between them. Not all that common to do in a paragraph situation like this, but definitely common in some trendy websites. Like let's take this brand up here, my brand, which has an ID of brand. We'll select that and set word or letter spacing rather to be, let's see what 10 pixels looks like. Okay, it looks all right. We'll get rid of that underline eventually. But that's common these days to have headings or text that's spaced out a bit. Makes it look a little more minimal or modern, I guess. I don't know. I'm not a designer. I don't know much about typography, but that is something that we can do. So that's letter spacing, word spacing, and line height. Next up, we'll talk about text decoration. Text decoration basically controls the underline on text, whether there is an underline or there's not an underline. But also we can add an overline, which is not common at all, but this right here is an overline, that green wavy line. We can have a line through, which is sometimes common if you're making a to-do list or something. And we can also change the color and the style of each line. It can be wavy or dotted, just a solid line. I think we can do dashed as well. So let's play around with it. Text decoration is a shorthand property. I'm not going to spend the time to go over every single individual property, but there is a text decoration line, color, and style property, and a newer thickness property, although this does not actually work in Chrome last time I checked. So text decoration is shorthand for those 3 or 4 pieces, kind of like border is shorthand for multiple pieces as well. So let's play around with it. First thing I'll show you is we can remove the underline off of links. So brand is a link right there. I can set text decoration to be none. And now we've gotten rid of that underline. So that's one option to use text decoration. But I can also underline something like this I am H1. Let's select H1 and set text decoration to be underline. That's the simplest thing we can do. It will just have the same color as our text. But I can also do something like underline and then pink. And we get a pink underline. I can even do pink and then make it wavy. And we get our wavy underline. So we can also set things like an overline. And let's do a solid lavender. Sure. That is an overline there. You can also make it dashed or dotted. Let's see how that looks. Okay. And then we also have line through, which is another option. And let's do a red solid. That's line through. So those are different options for text decoration. Not that common to do a lot of them, but sometimes removing the underline, especially off of links, or adding underlines in if you need them somewhere stylistically, strike through or line through effect to cross something off like a to-do list item. So text decoration is shorthand for a whole bunch of properties that dictate basically underlines and assorted other types of lines around your text. Next up, we have text transform, which is how we can change the casing of some text using only CSS. So we have a couple options: capitalize, uppercase, lowercase, and none, and then some other more niche options that I've never used, like full size kana, which I believe has to do with Japanese characters. But let's just focus on the capitalize, uppercase, lowercase for now. So if I wanted to make this H1 right here all lowercase letters through my code, I could do text transform without actually changing anything in the HTML, lowercase. And now every letter is lowercase. Or I could do uppercase which makes every word, or every single letter rather, all caps. Or I can do capitalize, which will make every first letter of a word uppercase. But I'm going to go with lowercase. It looks a little trendier for now. Okay. Then I could do the same thing for these nav links. And actually, why don't I restyle them a little bit? I'm going to make them all inline, so we end up with something kind of resembling a nav bar. So I'm going to select them. I think I'm going to start by taking the nav element, the UL elements, and the LI elements, and making them inline. Let's see how that looks, and maybe even inline block, so I can play around a bit more. And then I'm going to select the anchor tags inside of that UL. And I think I'm going to scale them down a tiny bit. How about, what are they at right now? Maybe 15 pixels. Give them a different color. Maybe gray. Steel blue. I don't know. And then give them a bit of margin. What should we do? 0 pixels up and down, left and right, maybe 10 pixels, maybe even more. And let's make them all caps. Text, transform, uppercase. Yeah, whatever. Fine enough. So that's text transform. And lastly, we've got a pretty fun property, which is text shadow. So text shadow adds shadows to text, specifically shadows that follow the shape of the text. There are other types of shadows in CSS, like a box shadow, which is going to be a shadow around a box, not around the actual text itself. So here are some simple examples of things you can do with text shadow. None of these are particularly beautiful. Basically, we need to specify at a bare minimum an offset X and an offset Y, and then a color. Although I think if we don't do a color, it might just use the text color. But we need to specify where the shadow should be offset to the right or left, and then up or down, how many pixels. And you can use other units too, but I'll use pixels, and then a color. So why don't we do it on these H2s here. So I'll select, do I have H2s anywhere? No. All right, H2s, text shadow, and then some offset. Let's do 10 pixels for X and Y. And then a color like magenta. And there is our first text shadow. Now if I instead did 10 pixels X and 5 pixels Y, you'll see it moves up. If I did negative 10 pixels Y, we move up above, and negative 10 pixels for X will be left and above. All right, so that's the first thing that we can do. We also could, do 1 pixel and have it just barely offset, like that. Then I'm going to add this back in, maybe 5, negative 5 and 5. Then we can also set a blur radius, which is going to dictate how much the shadow spreads out, how much it blurs. So the higher the value, the bigger the blur. And this is also a pixel value. And the default is 0. So there is no blurring happening at all on those H2s. Now, why don't I make the text bigger just so you can see this better? Font size, maybe 80 pixels. Okay, so if I add in a blur, let's do 5 pixels, you can see that it now blurs. If I do a much larger blur, like 20 pixels, it's a lot lighter overall and it spreads much further. And then if we go back to 0, which is the default, or we can just leave that off, there's no blurring at all. Now we can have multiple text shadows, so I'll show you that here. If we have, I guess we'll do magenta, and then comma. Let's do another shadow afterwards. How about negative 10 pixels, 10 pixels, and cyan. There you go. We just separate them by commas. And I'll do one more. Negative 15 pixels, yellow. Not terribly beautiful, but we've got 3 different text shadows in a single line here, separated by commas. Okay, so I'm going to resize that back down to whatever the default is. Yikes, it's pretty tough to read there with these large gaps. Maybe I'll resize this 2 pixels at a time, 4, and 6 or something. Let's see how that looks. Yeah, I guess that's fine enough. All right, Then I'll also show you that if we set a text shadow on something like this H1, which also has a text decoration style, this is considered part of the text, that text decoration. So if I do a text shadow on that, how about maybe 3 pixels, and then I've got a color that I found that it looks okay, I think. Okay, let's see. Yeah, that's not terrible. We could add a blur radius. I don't think I want it though. I kind of like the sharper look, but I'm also not a designer. So there's a simple text shadow. That's kind of all there is to text shadows. You can have multiple, like we had here. You can change their opacity, of course, using a RGBA color or an HSLA color. So we could have them overlap a bit and actually show through instead of what we have right here. And I think that's enough for now. All right, so we've covered a ton of different text-related properties, ranging from the very common, important ones, font family, font size, font weight, text align, to the less common and still interesting ones, like text decoration or letter spacing or text shadow. I hope you enjoyed it, or at the very least did not fall asleep. And I guess I hope you learned something too. As always, please consider sharing this video or the first video of this entire course, 10, 11 videos ago, however many it was, with anyone who might benefit from learning to code, anyone who's bored. You know the drill if you've been here. I know I'm asking you in every single video, but thank you. And lastly, have a nice day or night. Stay safe, stay healthy, wash your hands, stay sane, and I will see you shortly. All right, bye everyone.